Step inside an Infiniti QX55.
Your poor, poor, poor office mate.
I don't know what you're talking about, Mike.
You must crush the wheels of industry under the might of your keys. Take them down. These are the rules that you have to win.
I only realized after the video went up, and a lot of people were leaving a bunch of comments about my office mate who must have been overhearing me do this script over and over again. I only realized once reading those the true strangeness of his perspective, because he rented the office next to mine at some point in the summer when I was away. And though I never see him because I don't have to walk past his office, he does see my office. And so he would have walked past this empty room with 2 desks stacked on top of each other and no chair and nothing inside of it, and thought, I wonder what's going on in the office next door.
I wonder why this storage closet is unattended.
Right, exactly.
Because why would there be 2 tables on top of each other? They were just storing them.
Perfectly reasonable assumption. And then, at some point from his perspective, the neighbor just shows up and is walking through this half-written script on the rules of power constantly at odd hours. Like he never would have heard me talking about anything other than this single topic. And he would have heard me talking just this morning, doing it again with the follow-up videos. But so this is, whatever it is, from the start of September until now, this is all he has heard from me next door. After being in the office on his own for a while, probably wondering what the deal is with the strange room next door. And then finding out.
I don't know if he's found out.
Yeah, I don't mean found out as in he understands what's occurring. I mean found out as in like, oh, this is what's next door. A crazy person.
I don't even know if you think that was crazy. Like, it would be scary. So we're talking about the rules for rulers video.
Yes.
The worst part of this is that this isn't even a hello, I'm CGP Grey talking to you, the internet video. This is I am a dictator, and I am telling you, learned dictator, who's trying to rise up the ranks, how to control the world. That's the real problem with this, is it's not just explaining these things, it's
right.
Talking about them as if you're already doing them.
Yeah, it was a little bit of the screw tape letters, like of the senior demons talking to the lower level demon. Like this is kind of what it was. And so yes, this is why on the last episode we had that little bit of a discussion about, like in your videos, thinking about the things you're adding on the screen as the editor, as like a separate person. I was very aware in writing and rewriting this video, spending a lot of time trying to find like what is the voice, like how am I actually going to talk through all of these things. And I did eventually decide on exactly what that was, which is this feeling like this is someone who is instructing an apprentice. Like that's the mood that I'm going for here. That's what I'm going to try to achieve when I record the audio. And as people might not realize, like when I'm actually working through the script, I am saying it just like that because I'm trying to hear how are each of these lines going to sound when they're spoken. So the voice in that video is the voice next door to this guy for months.
So dear listener, if you've not yet watched this video, go and watch this video now, because we're going to talk about it and it won't make any sense to you otherwise. Now, I want to know where the idea for this one came from, because it's kind of like some of the other stuff that you've done, like in that you've done videos about mayors and popes and kings and things like that. So there's some links there, and I guess there is some geographical ties to it because you're talking about controlling countries, but it feels a little bit different, and also the presentation was a little bit different. So, like, where did your original idea for this one come from?
So there's a thing when I look at the videos that I make. There's going to be maybe a recurring theme in this conversation, but I often just see what they are not. Like, I'm very aware of all the things that they leave out and that they don't talk about, or what I intended to do but haven't actually done. And so for the last US election, I was working on a video that was a big combination of all of the things that are wrong with the United States government, like the mechanisms of the way that it works. I think the US just happens to have a bunch of pieces that individually wouldn't be so bad, but all together add up to be a problem. And I was working on this script for a while, and I ended up not making it for the last election, but it was a thing that I kind of tinkered on for a while. And a big video about something about like the big scale picture of the structure of politics was always on my mind. And I ended up reading a bunch of books that were around this topic, like covering it from different angles. And at some point, maybe 2 years ago, I'd have to look at my book list for precisely when it was, but I think about 2 years ago, I came across The Dictator's Handbook. And I felt like, this book is doing a great job of synthesizing a bunch of the things that have been rolling around in my head and making a coherent picture out of a bunch of little pieces of things that I wanted to talk about, and trying to show like a way to think about this stuff as a theory to explain the actions of rulers. Essentially, my original script that was entirely about the United States that I was tinkering with, the part about the US like kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller with each draft, and each time more and more and more about the structure of politics took over, until eventually at some point I realized, you know what, I think this is actually better to just do as like an elucidation of the ideas in the book. And so if you watch the video, there is one section, maybe it's like 15 minutes in, but I just quickly say about how, in a democracy, there's a couple of tools you can use to help reduce the number of voters you need to get into office. Like, you can change the voting system, you can gerrymander the boundaries, you can have party pre-elections with complicated rules that limit who people can vote for. And once the re-election rates are super high and the approval rates are really low, you know that you've won. That paragraph is the only thing that's left from what was thousands and thousands of words of a different script that was focused on the United States. So like, it's a funny experience for me to watch it and see that like one thing over the space of years thinking about a topic like gets smushed down and compressed, and something else grows around it. So that's the way the script looks from my perspective.
One of my favorite things was watching the video, and I'm maybe about 12 or 13 minutes in, something like that, and it dawns on me that all of these things could apply to companies and CEOs. And then you reference it, like you call it out at the end, which is awesome. But there was this moment where I was like, oh no. CEOs are really just dictators.
Yeah, well, to also go with the theme of things left out, this video ended up being just a really brutal thing to make. This turned out to be the hardest thing that I have yet written to date. Previously, Humans Need Not Apply held that mantle, but this one has definitely taken that by quite a wide margin, because the first drafts of this video were 15,000 words long. And for comparison, the final version is about 3,000 words long. And it's because this idea touches on so many aspects, like with companies, that I wanted to talk about all of these different pieces, right? Like, how does this relate to this? How does this relate to that? And it was very hard to make that workable. But the section on companies is like a very obvious thing to think about, and it may come up in a follow-up video. But the reason I didn't talk about companies is because there's an unavoidable additional piece of information that I'd have to talk about if I want to talk about companies that I had to leave out of this first video because it was just too much. Like every time I ran the idea past other people when I was talking about this project, I could see like, oh, this is the moment when I lose you. So I had to leave it out of this, but it's this idea of the relationship between the ruler and the keys to power, and how replaceable are the keys to power. And you can end up in situations where you have a ruler who has a small number of keys, but they're very highly replaceable, right? Or a ruler who has a large number of keys, but it's very difficult to replace them. And this is essentially best understood when you're thinking about like companies and boards of directors, that essentially the more power a CEO has over the board, the more the CEO is able to replace the members of the board, the more leeway that CEO has. Right? Like they have more power to just do what they want. But if the CEO is not able to replace their board members, then the CEO is like much more beholden to what the board wants versus what the CEO wants to do.
Feels something like the founder's advantage.
There's an excellent story. I've actually never verified if this is true. It sounds so true. I have a hard time not believing it because it's related to Steve Jobs here.
It's like I was wondering how far we'd go into this conversation before he popped up.
Right, yeah. But I have heard, I'll be curious to know in the comments if this is true or not. But I have heard that on the return to Apple after Steve Jobs had been banished the first time when the board had gotten rid of him, that one of his key negotiating requirements was that he was able to pack the board with his own cronies, and he was able to get rid of a bunch of people who were on the board of directors. And I think like that's a perfect example of people think of the company as like the expression of the individual, right? But it can only be an expression of the individual if they're very secure in their position of power. Steve Jobs was no fool coming back to Apple.
Fool me once.
Yeah, exactly. So he set it up so that he was in a position where he was able to do whatever he wanted with the company. It's like, that's why he was able to make decisions that were egregiously unpopular sometimes. But it's because he had control over the board, right? Whereas there are plenty of examples where the CEO has essentially no control over the board, and then the CEO is just a puppet, right? They're not actually like an actor who is influencing the direction of the company. Like they can't influence the board, so the board influences them. But this idea of how replaceable are the key supporters, it was like one idea too many. Mm-hmm. And it ends up like bringing in talking about companies. So I did leave it off, but I had to, as you mentioned, like I had to reference it at the end because I did just want to call it out. Like, this is not just politics.
I would have been almost disappointed if you didn't,
Yeah.
Because it was so clear to me when watching it.
So why was it clear to you? Like, were you thinking of anything in particular?
Just having worked in a multinational corporation, like you can see the idea of the keys and like the protection of the keys, and even from like a financial perspective, right? The keys are rewarded, and it's like, okay, I can see all of this. Like I can see how this layering effect is so, even down to things like talking about the control of the way that money moves people, and even like down to like the peasant idea.
Who are the peasants in this metaphor, Mike?
I wouldn't even know. But it's like this kind of staging of people and power and financial reward that like goes from the bottom to the top. Like that is a multinational corporation.
It's one of those things where, I don't know, sometimes I feel like I'm talking about ideas that are almost so obvious, it's like, why even discuss them? And I think I mentioned last time, but this often happens to me when I'm writing a script. There's some point where I look at it and I think, why am I even talking about this? Like, isn't it obvious to say that people in power have people who help them stay in power? But I do think that like there is real value in laying it out in a small, concise, simple manner, because I have to cast my mind back to remember, like, I feel like this pulled together some ideas that were rolling around in my head, but it's different to see it laid out. And it's like, okay, this makes sense. Right? This makes sense how you can see in a company or in a business how when someone gets promoted, they often try to bring their immediate subordinates with them, right, wherever they're going. You're like, why? Why would they do that? It's like, this is why, right? They're trying to bring their power base up together. Like it's a kind of reward for the people who have helped them. I think it's a really harsh but necessary lesson for people to understand who are working within businesses, that like often what the people above you want is not what is ostensibly good for the whole company. Like they want you to do things that make them look good to the people that they are keys to, right? Like it's this hierarchy that's going up. And I think it's if you can think about that, like it's in some ways it's not a pleasant thought, but I find it like an incredibly liberating and clarifying thought. Like, okay, I understand what this structure is. I think my earliest example of this, years and years ago, like the first time I had to face one of these ideas of what does the machine tell you it is versus what is the machine actually. So I went to college primarily to do physics at university. And the way courses and time happened to work out, I ended up with a bunch of time in my final year as a senior in university. And I was trying to think about what to do. And this was around the time I was also getting interested in economics. And I had a friend of mine who was getting interested in economics. And the two of us sat down and we looked at the course load one day and we realized, oh, hey, we can actually fit a whole economics minor in the last 2 semesters of our senior year, right? As we're sitting there in junior year trying to plan out the next year. Like, oh, this is really interesting. Like we can, let's do this, right? We have the time. There's nothing else we're going to do. You know, might as well. Like, what does it hurt to add an additional minor to our graduation? So we intended to do this. We signed up for all of the classes, right? And we're going to these classes, and it was like an interesting, fun time. And me and my friend, we were doing really well in the classes because we had a ridiculous unfair advantage, which is that many of the classes we were taking were essentially freshman level classes, right? And we're 2 seniors in these classes. And also the way economics is structured, a lot of the really hard stuff, like the math, are specific instances of general cases in physics. Right, so basically, like if you have done a physics degree, a lot of the hard math in economics is a lot easier to do just because you've seen it or you've seen something very similar to it before. So my friend and I were doing really well in these classes. And then essentially what happens is that the head of the economics department gets the dean of the university to boot my friend and I out of the classes after the cutoff of when you could theoretically drop classes are. Like we're just ejected from these classes. And it was like so infuriating. Like we couldn't get any reason. Like, why did this happen? I don't understand why this happened. We're really screwed now because now we're part-time students all of a sudden, right? When we'd planned to be full-time students, which has all of these effects on your funding and where you can live on campus. Like it was a huge problem. And, you know, I was rather upset at the time. And I eventually found out through one of the physics professors that the reason this occurred is because the university had a structure that determined how grading curves could be used. And that my friend and I were ruining the curve for the economics classes. And that we were making that class look like they were much worse and getting much worse grades. And so the head of the economics department got rid of us because it was bringing down her average grade reports up to the university dean. And she had some favors that she could pull from him to get a thing that's not supposed to happen.
Top level was too high. You were weighting it poorly.
The difference between the grades that my friend and I were getting were too far from the rest of the class. So we were artificially pushing down the grades of the other students, which then reflected badly on the economics chair, right? And so And so this was like a really eye-opening moment of, oh, okay. This university is busy telling me about how it is a place of learning.
Yes, this is where it is maybe harshest.
And there's a huge amount of that is true, but if you do learning in the wrong way, you suddenly discover that there's a bunch of kingdoms, right? That there are kingdoms that are defending resources, that are negotiating for various things with each other. And that if you end up on the wrong side of these things, you are but a pawn in this larger system. Like, and that was a very, very eye-opening early example of this to me.
So like, what this makes me think of, and it's like a harsh reality that I face. It's very similar in this, and it's why it's so shocking to learn about or think about any of these things in this way, from democracy to all the way down to education, is that people care about themselves more than the thing they are supposed to be doing. So in this instance, the professor cared more about her job and her grades and how that looked on her than your learning.
Right.
And for me, it was like people cared more about their own job performance than about the customers of the bank.
Right.
Or doing what's right for the person. They cared more about their own job performance, not even necessarily the bottom line of the company, just their own personal job performance. And how frustrating I used to find that, because I liked to believe in the greater good of it all. Old innocent Mike over here, like that. I thought we were supposed to be doing the right thing. And that's where like these things become harsh. And as I said, like, it is harshest in your example because it is, I am a student trying to learn, and I have been denied the education because it makes somebody else look bad.
Yeah. It's funny, like I am the most, let it go kind of person that is possibly alive, but every once in a while I remember that, and I feel like I should have gotten that economics minor, but because of just some like political thing,
yeah,
right? As it didn't have, like, what does it matter, right? Like, it matters not at all. It doesn't matter for anything. I ended up going to graduate school for economics anyway. Like, it affected nothing in my life, but like, it just, I think sometimes I remember it because it is that facing the reality of the thing versus the idea of the thing.
Yep.
And yeah, that's what it was.
And I think that's why people have been enjoying this video, because it's like the macabre of finding this out is exciting and interesting. Right? Like, I think that's why the video seems to be doing really well from a numbers perspective. I want to come to those numbers in a minute. But like, I've seen a lot of people talking really positively about the video from an enjoyment perspective, because it's like breaking social norms in a way, like the things that we expect of these people.
I think a thing that I have a hard time conveying is this idea of, I'm not being cynical here, but I think cynical is a word that's sometimes used to dismiss a thing. But I feel like I am trying to talk about the reality of something which might be uncomfortable to acknowledge.
It's not cynicism, it's realism. Like, this is what is happening. And I still like to believe that there are dual parts of this. Like, the people will try and get themselves into office because they want to be powerful, right? Like, I think you have to have that thing in your brain that not everybody has, like the desire to want power in the first place. But there are still people within that system that want to do an element of good.
Yeah.
It's not saying that like it's all bad, but there are bad parts of it that you have to know to be able to understand the good.
Yeah, it's like it is not a refutation that there are no good politicians and nobody's intentions are good. Right? But it is just simply trying to acknowledge the structure in which people work.
Yeah.
Right? And it's a different thing from just being cynical about the idea that like, oh, all politics is terrible. It's like, I'm not saying that, but what I'm trying to say is, if you're working in a business, if you want to go into politics, if you want to be effective for the right reasons, you need to understand how this works.
Yeah. There are things you're going to need to give up.
Yeah, there are things you're going to need to give up. There's things that you're going to need to do. And it's one of the reasons why, like, you know, I sometimes joke online about, like, oh, being president or being king. But it's like, I am perfectly well aware that I have no interest in actually doing that, because I would be no good at the things that are required to be in those positions of power. It's not like it's hard to sit down and come up with ideas about how things could run better. Almost anybody can do that. Like, it's pretty easy to look at any structure of power and come up with a way that they could do a thing better.
Yep.
But that's a totally different question of what would you need to do to get into a position where you could really actually change the thing that you're complaining about. Like, that's a totally different question. You know, and I think most people aren't willing to do that. And that's the way things are. But I don't view it as a kind of cynicism, and I think it's a useful thing to think about. Like, I mean, this is before I came across the Dictator's Handbook, but even when I was working as a teacher, I was much more aware of the power structure of the school and how it related to me as a teacher working in the school. And it's like, there is no doubt that thinking about this stuff from one level removed made my life way easier, because I was aware of doing things like signaling to certain people, I am not interested in promotion. Like, I am a cog in this machine, right? This is my role. I'm happy to be here. Like, I am at the bottom level of this. I am no competition for you. We're not going for the same job. Like, I'm just going to be a physics teacher. That's all I want to do. And then understanding that the best way for me to be left alone is simply never cause problems for my managers. Right? So, like, constantly thinking about, what do the managers need to see? How can I do that? And other stuff is not necessarily as important.
Yeah.
That's how I'm going to fly under the radar. It's like, I can let some stuff go in this job if I recognize, like, ultimately, what does my manager not care about?
That's the thing I'm jealous of, because I knew I needed to be that way to be left alone. I just couldn't keep my mouth shut.
But it's so hard, right? It's so hard, and it's so frustrating, and you can be sitting in a meeting, and I would definitely have this, of sitting in a meeting and just reminding myself, like, just keep your mouth shut. Just don't say anything, because there's no, like, you have no political capital here to actually do anything. You've set that up on purpose so that you're not going to be conflicting with anybody. All you want is for this meeting to be over and to be back doing your side projects as soon as possible. Like, that's the actual goal, right? Don't interject.
I was such a nightmare. I had two modes in meetings.
Mm-hmm.
I cracked endless jokes.
Mm-hmm.
In a way that I don't in any other such situation in life. I don't make as many jokes as when I would sit in these meetings. I would just make fun of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And or I would start shouting. They were my two modes. Make jokes, start shouting.
It's not good, Mike.
I couldn't help
Not good.
myself.
No.
I am very opinionated, and as much as I hated my job, I cared about the core of it. Like, I had a belief in a thing that I was doing, because I can't do something unless I believe in it. Like, I would have just not been able to do it at all, which is like, that was how I got in my job prior to the marketing job. I cared about it so little that I used to go into the office and do nothing. I would go in for 8 hours and I didn't do a thing, right? So, do not advise that course of action. I want to come back to something that it's kind of like a little elephant in the room that we've not discussed yet, which is the fact that this video is 20 minutes long.
Mm-hmm.
This is abnormal. There has been one other video on your channel that's reached kind of over this probably around 10-minute mark. Your videos tend to be under 10 minutes. And that was one that you've already mentioned a moment ago, which was Humans Need Not Apply, which is a 15-minute video, which was also a pain in the ass.
Yeah.
And now you've done this one, which is 20 minutes, plus later follow-ups, which you've mentioned. And you call out maybe 2 or 3 of those in the video. So I want to know, like, at what point in this process did this become a single 20-minute video and not like two 10-minute videos? And was this decision related in any way to YouTube's seeming preference now for watch time over views?
Yeah, it's a good question.
So for people that don't know, typically in the history of YouTube, views have been king. The way to get promoted most in the algorithm, the way to get on the front page, the way to get the most money from your ads was to get the most views. YouTube has pretty much silently changed this. It's one of these things that, as I've looked more and more into this, there are many things on YouTube that just get passed from person to person because somebody told someone, and then it kind of moves out.
This is definitely a thing that happens, which is everybody trying to speculate, and a game of telephone occurs about what the algorithm may or may not be doing. It's very hard to try to separate that from what is the algorithm actually doing.
But the current agreed upon consensus is that watch time, which is the amount of time somebody spends watching a video, is worth more to you than views. So what a lot of people are doing now is making longer videos so you get more minutes that can be viewed. So it pushes your watch time up, pushes you through the algorithm, enhances your ad rates. And it is believed that YouTube is trying to do this to curb view clickbait, because people will give clickbaity titles. You get the view, you get the number, but then people stop watching within 20 seconds because it's actually not what they were tuning in for. So watch time, and we were talking about those retention figures last time, that kind of go hand in hand. That is more indicative of a video being worthwhile if somebody has watched through most of it. So the watch time seems to be the thing that people are focusing on. So a 20-minute video has a higher chance of getting more allotted minutes than a 4-minute video.
Yeah, there's a few things that are mixed together with the conversation that occurs around watch time. And I actually recently just put a ton of data from all of my videos into a bunch of spreadsheets to try to take a look at the data on my own channel and how it relates to watch time, precisely because of what you said before, of trying to figure out like how much of this is just rumor, how much of this is real. Is there anything that I can pull out of my own data set to try to get an answer to this? And there's two questions. One of which is, how much does YouTube promote a video if it has a large amount of watch time? And ultimately, I think that's unknowable. Like the effect that has, I just don't know. I can say with an extremely high degree of confidence that YouTube is using watch time as a proxy for video quality. This is the best metric they've come up with to try to figure out, is this a video that people want to see?
I think that's sensible on paper.
Let's just say I had some interesting conversations with some people about this, and I can't come up with a better way. You need to have some kind of number to feed the machine about like how good our videos are, or how not good our videos. Watch time seems pretty good, and I've lived through the various phases where you can see that the YouTube algorithm is poorly attuned